Welcome to another broadcast of Truth Be Told. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and I'm with your co-host, the one and only Captain Ron. In honor of Martin Luther King Jr. and Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we have live with us author and professor John Kirk talking about his book, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement, Controversies and Debates. In this discussion, we will shine a powerful light on the Civil Rights Movement and its most influential leader, Martin Luther King Jr. We will discuss Martin Luther King's relationship with Malcolm X and other leaders and controversies and debates surrounding his assassination and his impact on America and the world. Now, Professor Kirk is a George Washington Donahue Professor of History and Director of the Institute on Race and Ethnicity at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. His research interests cover topics such as King's leadership, local civil rights struggles, and African-American, Southern, and U.S. history in the 20th century. Let's welcome to Truth Be Told, where we believe in experience becomes truth, Professor and author John A. Kirk. Should we call you Captain Kirk?
Oh, man.
I'm sure you haven't heard that before.
Right, yeah, that's the first time.
I know, right? Well, welcome to Truth Be Told. I am so excited to have you here because I'm a big history buff.
You're buff. So.
And I'm buff. But Martin Luther King was, and I think is one of the most influential men of our generation, the generations before, and pretty much in the history of America, because he changed America as we know it. So I know you're from England. So before we talk about your books, because you have many, but let's go back to where you grew up. You grew up in England. So tell us how you went from England, a white guy from England, to writing about American racism and
in Arkansas
in
specifically.
Arkansas. So start back where you're from.
Right, I grew up in the northwest of England, near Manchester, and I attended undergraduate school at University of Nottingham, where I took American Studies. So I had a fairly early interest in American history and culture. And when I was a senior, I wrote my thesis on William Faulkner and race. And that really got me interested in American race relations. And then I studied my PhD at the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. Interestingly, University of Newcastle was the first British university to award Martin Luther King an honorary doctorate, which it did in 1967. So King traveled over there in 1967. And when I graduated with my PhD from there, I did so 30 years exactly after King graduated from there with his honorary degree. So there's quite a link between Britain and the United States and African-American culture that's fairly long-lasting. I remember a poll that came out in the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom about 15, 20 years ago now that asked school children, high school children, who their number one hero was. And Martin Luther King came top of that poll at the time, second only to David Beckham, who was one of the United's leading footballers at the time. So he's very internationally well-known and internationally renowned figure. I think sometimes people in the United States forget just what a worldwide, global figure he was at the time and has been ever since.
So I know when Martin Luther King began the civil rights movement. Well, he really made an impact, but we don't realize how young he was. He was fairly young when he became really the leader of this civil rights movement.
That's right. In his mid-20s, a very raw recruit, graduate school. The job that he got in Montgomery, Alabama, was his first job. He was straight out of graduate school at Boston, still finishing his PhD at the time, and had just got married, had a growing family. So yeah, he was very, very young and quite naive in some ways. And it's, the boycott happened in Montgomery, and he was sort of pulled into it. He wasn't really the instigator of the boycott at all. The leadership was sort of thrust on him at a very young age, and I think partly his youth had an important part to play in him taking on that leadership role, because many of the other preachers in the community that were called upon were very wary of taking a leadership role in that growing bus boycott. And in some ways, King's naivety and rawness sort of led him to take that leadership position. So yeah, he was very young at the time. You look at the photographs of him during the Montgomery bus boycott, you can see just how young a man he was.
So when you look back, why do you think this one man made such a difference when so many others spoke out and marched and did their part in the movement? Sure. Why did this one man? What was it about him that you feel that he rose above everything else to make such a difference?
It's a fascinating question, and a lot of historians have debated this relationship between the man and the movement. And of course, King didn't do it all himself.
Right.
He built upon grassroots activism of many people over many years and many decades before Martin Luther King. But he certainly came in at a moment of important change. I think he came in at an important moment, so the timing was important. He was in the right place at the right time. But he also had a number of abilities that he developed over time. As we said, he was very young when he got into civil rights activism. But he was a very articulate speaker, as we know, and we remember him a lot through his speeches now. But he, developed an idea of nonviolent direct action alongside others. He was a great face of the movement, but he also, because the Montgomery bus boycott really became one of the first widely publicized mass movements, he was there at the very beginning, and the press sort of seized on him as a local leader. And that national exposure that the Montgomery bus boycott got then led to him becoming a national figure, and it sort of took off from there. So it's a mixture, I think, of a right person at the right place at the right time, as of course history a lot of times is about.
So he was a nonviolent civil rights activist, where others were not. Why, in your research, why did the FBI look at him
as the FBI guy,
right? Well, which he was on before, but why did they look at him as almost like a homegrown terrorist?
I think the hostility to the FBI came from the larger hostility to the civil rights movement. We look back today and we look at the civil rights movement, and of course it's been written into the national folklore of the United States, and everybody, most people I think would agree it's a good thing, and it has a lot of consensus now. But we forget often that at the time, in the mid-1950s, civil rights activists were seen as radicals, perhaps dangerous radicals. Just after the sort of McCarthy era, there was a fear that civil rights equated to communism, and civil rights activists were often tried to be tarred with communism and communist-leaning activities. So, the FBI thought of the civil rights movement as a dangerous movement and saw King as the leader of that movement as a dangerous leader. In fact, it's kind of interesting. One of the things that plays into King emerging as a civil rights leader, I think, is that Cold War context and the fact that initially, he is a preacher and a fairly conservative preacher, and in some ways beyond reproach of being tainted by a communist brush. There's a big change in the civil rights movement in the mid-1950s, and that McCarthyism has decimated a lot of the left-leaning groups who had carried the civil rights movement up to that point. So King's relative conservatism and his religious background played an important role in him emerging at that time and taking the place of other leaders who've been at the forefront of the movement previously.
Isn't it amazing how he's saying, you forget this was the mid-50s. It feels so long ago that we would think that way, because it's so foreign to the way I think, thanks to this movement and thanks to King and everybody like this, because it just seems like, oh, God, this was, 1,000 years ago when this was like?
Right.
But that was just before us.
Yeah. I mean, I was born like, a year after he was assassinated?
All right.
So there was King, even though he was a conservative, like you said, he was a minister. There was a lot of controversies also around him, his personal life, political life. So could you give us some of those? Because he was human. I mean, Martin Luther King was a human. He was a man. Could you just give us some of the controversies that people may have forgotten?
Is that what you found out in your research, that he was a human and a man?
No, he wasn't human, no. I don't think he was. No, just kidding. But can you give us some that maybe people just forgot about? It doesn't take away from what he's done.
That's right. And, one of the interesting things with King, I think, is that a lot of the controversies that came out about him, or revelations about him, came out after he died, or after he was assassinated. So King has never been around to really address or answer any of those things. Right. And, of course, in the 50s and 60s, when he was active, it was a different kind of time, and the media reported in different kinds of ways. And it's interesting to think about the things that have subsequently come out about King. What would happen if he were active today, and how it would have affected a modern day political leader. One of the things that has come out, I guess, is the plagiarism of his PhD thesis, for example. When the Martin Luther King Papers Project were compiling the papers at Stanford University, and that's still an ongoing process. One of the first volumes looked at King's classroom work from Boston University, and they discovered that he plagiarized up to about a third of his PhD thesis, which, of course, would have been quite a scandal at the time, and if he were alive today, in the midst of a movement today, would certainly have been trolled over by 24-hour news and Twitter and all those things. But at the time, nobody really picked up on that, and nobody really knew about it. Same is true of Martin Luther King's, alleged affairs, which didn't surface at the time, but of course, which would have been hugely damaging if they had been revealed during his time in office. Although, what's interesting is that a lot of the media at the time didn't feel that they should release that kind of information. So the media showed a lot more restraint then. So King emerged in a very different kind of media climate than the one we have today. And it's fascinating to think about what would have happened to King if he were running the civil rights movement today.
Oh, he'd have been the president, because look at...
That's funny. I think they would have had a field day if that was true. I mean, some of the stories were true. And I know people in the African American community, not everybody looked up to him. And could you tell us why some of the people in the African American community at that time were not in favor of Martin Luther King?
Well, I think probably a variety of reasons. Again, we often think of King as head and shoulders above everybody else and the leader of the civil rights movement. But, there were the big six so-called civil rights organizations nationally in the 1950s and 60s, and lots of competition on a local level as well for leadership. So King's dominance today is more exaggerated than it was at the time. And there were rivals to King, as we've discussed. Civil rights movement in the 1950s was seen as 50s and 60s was seen as a fairly radical thing, not as accepted part of American folklore as it is now. So, it was a very different kind of time.
And can you tell us, because at that time also Malcolm X was fairly well known and he had his own movement. Could you tell us the relationship between those two and kind of the differences of the two?
Yeah, I mean, the two only met once in person in Washington, D.C. at Congress in March 1964. So although, they're often held up against one another and contrast with one another, their personal relationship was fairly slight in terms of actual personal interaction. And of course, the two leaders came to be seen as diametric opposites. And of course, only as time has passed on have we sort of continue with that. Malcolm X was from the North, whereas Martin Luther King was a Southerner. And those were important distinctions. Malcolm X had a background from the West Indies. He, of course, was a minister of Islam, whereas King was very deeply involved, had a very solid Christian background and had a career as a minister. So, we often kind of look at the two as opposites. But it's important to remember, both men were assassinated at the age of 39. So they both died at quite a young age.
Right.
Certainly feels young to me at 46.
Right.
But we can tend to sort of view them as very contrasted figures, but they both changed over time. Malcolm X had a long journey of change. Martin Luther King had a long journey of change, and both of them had relatively short careers as activists. King went from Montgomery to Memphis in the space of about 12, 13 years. So they've had relatively short careers to have such a huge impact. And they changed tremendously over those years. You know, as we said, King was very young when he took on a leadership mantle, and he grew up within the movement, within, you know, a fast-paced movement where there are rapidly changing times. So King and Malcolm X both changed over time. So I think we should try to avoid thinking of either leader as a snapshot and look at, you know, kind of how they changed over time. And in some ways they were similar, in some ways they were quite a bit different. And those similarities and differences changed as they both changed over time.
And how did Martin Luther King's, I guess, view on the civil rights movement change as he got older up until his assassination? Because I mean, I'm 47, so I know how my views were in my 20s are completely different to what they are now. So how did they change, and how did it change the movement itself?
Yeah, I think King went through important transformations during his life, and particularly because of his engagement with the civil rights movement. I think when he began in the mid-1950s, of course, the Montgomery bus boycott was about desegregating buses in Montgomery, Alabama. And then he tried to build on that movement and expand it. But the key goals, I suppose, of the civil rights movement, and particularly of King up to around the mid-1960s, were to end segregation in the United States, which was still steadfast in schools and in every other area of Southern life, and to attack voting rights too. Voting rights, most African Americans were still disfranchised throughout the region and, you know, didn't have the vote. So a lot of his first decade from 55 to 65 focused on campaigns that looked to desegregate local communities and get federal legislation passed. And he was very successful at that, along with other people as well. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed that ended segregation in public accommodations and facilities. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. But I think from 1965 to 1968 is a fascinating phase of development in King's life and thought, because by then the movement had achieved those two goals of essentially enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. So then the question was, where do we go next? I think King, having gone through much to reach that point, then looked back and thought, you know, we've gone through so much and we've achieved so much, and yet there's so much more to do, so much further to go. And campaigns to try and address housing inequalities in the North, to try and address economic inequalities, which he felt were central to continuing inequality in African American life. Of course, the Vietnam War was really important at that point, and King became involved in the Vietnam War and the anti-war movement. So King is perceived as certainly being more radical and taking a more radical stand in his final years than in his earlier years. And certainly it was a much more tumultuous time. So King certainly went through a lot of changes during his life. And I think the kind of up to 65 and since 65 is quite a different sort of Martin Luther King.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to take a quick break. We have to let our sponsors say their words. So we're going to take a quick break. So we're talking to John A. Kirk. He is a professor at the Institute on Race and Ethnicity. I can never say that word. Ethnicity. I say it. Anyway, in Little Rock, Arkansas. He also has a book that is so fascinating, and I hope you guys go out and pick it up. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. This man has made such an impact on America and the world. So we have more to talk about. We're going to talk about the assassination, and then what has been changed since his assassination, and what hasn't. And I hope you're ready for that. So don't go anywhere. This is Truth Be Told. I'm Tony Sweet,
Captain Ron,
and we're going to be right back. So don't go anywhere. From anxiety, from depression, maybe even chronic pain. Well, listen up. Truth Be Told is going to tell you about a breakthrough program built on over 100 years of therapies used in America's returning veterans to help you successfully overcome PTSD, anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. The secret proven in study after study. Music therapy. The effects of music are nothing short of amazing. From strokes to PTSD, music has been shown to improve the quality of life. Now, one of the latest music therapy programs being used in America's veteran hospitals can be yours to experience for free, at home, and to help your own anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. Or just relax after a hard day. It's called Whole Tones. It takes music therapy to a new level. This revolutionary program makes use of specifically designed frequencies that have been shown to stimulate your body's natural healing power down to a cellular level. If it works for battle-scarred vets, can it work for you? Well, experience it for yourself for free at sweetwholetones.com. Like Tony Sweet, that's SWEET. Go to sweetwholetones.com. Now enjoy the show. Do you suffer?
United States Pharmacopoeia, USP, sets the standard for most food supplements and are used in over 95% of all vitamin and mineral supplements in the world. The problem is that these products have never appeared in any living tissue. They're created in laboratories and are not recognizable to the body's metabolism. Grown by Nature products are different because they use renatured ingredients, proprietary blends of essential vitamins and minerals, with cofactors of proteins, lipids, and complex carbohydrates. Over 50 studies have been conducted on renatured nutrients, and over 20 have been published in peer-reviewed journals proclaiming their superiority. As a result, Grown by Nature vitamins and supplements are now recognized as simply the best available. Call 877-817-9829. That's 877-817-9829 and order your Grown by Nature products today. We are what we eat, and since we are of nature, we should eat foods in their natural form. Only Grown by Nature offers a full line of renatured nutrients. Call 877-817-9829. That's 877-817-9829 because not all products are grown by nature, but they should be.
All right, we're back. I'm Tony Sweet. We're here with Captain Ron.
And we're going to hear Tony say ethnicity.
No. I can't say it. It's like saying cinnamon. Cinnamon. Never mind.
Oh, boy.
Okay, so we have John A. Kirk, and we are talking about Martin Luther King, and we're talking about his book, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. I'm like I said, I'm a history buff. I love this time. 50s and 60s is one of my favorite times because so much was going on. I was born in 69. 68 was a huge loss for America because we lost Robert Kennedy and we lost Martin Luther King.
Isn't it hard to believe, though, like how he said that the voting thing just happened in 68?
I know.
I mean, that feels to me like that happened in 1901, right?
Right.
It does. It really does feel, it feels very separate from my existence.
And that's going to get to the questions that we're going to have about how racism today. But leading up to the assassination, in your research and when you talk to your students, I mean, there's a lot of controversy, a lot of conspiracy theory behind his assassination of really who killed Martin Luther King. Why do you feel like he was assassinated? I mean, your personal opinion. Why do you think?
I think King had a lot of enemies, of course. I mean, he was trying to change race relations in the South, and white Southerners had a huge amount of resistance to that. Of course, the United States had gone to a civil war in the 19th century over race relations, and the civil rights movement is often referred to as a second Reconstruction. So there are a lot of people who had a lot of reasons to dislike what King was doing, from the FBI on down to a local level. So death threats were a constant part of King's life on a day-to-day basis. So he knew his life was in danger a lot of the time, and often spoke about it in quite frank terms. When he saw the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, we're told he turned around to his wife and said, "This is such a sick society, and this is going to happen to me."
Wow.
So he lived with it day to day, and I think there are lots of people with lots of different reasons to assassinate King, which makes, of course, great fuel for controversy because there are so many suspects. The literature on this, and what I do with my students is just take them through the literature because it's fascinating to see how this debate itself unwinds. There are those who point to a large conspiracy, much like Kennedy. The Kennedy assassination literature is very much echoed in the Martin Luther King assassination literature. There's some who point to the long gunman thesis. It seems unbalanced that that it stretched beyond James Earl Ray, his convicted killer, but probably not to a large, full-scale conspiracy. It seems that white supremacists were involved, but it just seems to be that there are a lot of people who didn't like King for what he'd done, and he was a target. And this was one instance where an assassination attempt happened and worked. So I don't think it's a large-scale conspiracy, but probably did go beyond the lone gunman.
So do you think the assassination of Martin Luther King slowed the civil rights movement down, or did it add fuel and to the anger?
Did he become a martyr at that
yes,
point, kind of a thing?
It
seems
to
like
push it forward even faster. What's your opinion on that?
I think a bit of both. One of the things that did immediately happen after the King assassination was the passage of the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which include fair housing provisions. So one of the things that King's death immediately helped to do was to pass new civil rights legislation. So there was an outpouring of sympathy and remorse nationally in the aftermath of that. But the civil rights movement really had been changing and in flux in the final years of King's life anyway. So it'd be easy to see King's assassination as a very hard-edged switch between one kind of movement and the other. But King, the Black Power movement had begun to emerge in 1966. Mm-hmm. There were different kinds of African-American activism coming to the forefront during that period. So King was already in a state of flux at that time. The movement was already going through a change. I think King had changed in step with the times from 65 to 68 onwards. Of course, the fascinating thing in many ways is that we only have a few years of his life to think about the new kinds of directions that King was going in. And of course, he didn't live beyond that. So we don't know how exactly he would have developed, but we have lots of tantalizing sort of glimpses at the way that he was moving in a new direction that causes a lot of speculation for us to think about, where he might have gone had he lived.
Wow. I mean, yeah, I know you had a question about
Well, I was thinking about like today, like it just seems to me, I guess we live in a bubble here because I don't feel racism much at all. I don't see that as much but lately in the last few years, it just seems like this has crept back up, like with the Dallas stuff and with these cop shootings. It just seems like racism has really accelerated in America.
Well, even with the new administration.
Even that. Exactly. Yeah. Even the new administration. Just in the last 24 months. Do you feel that way? And do you think that, what is your take on that?
Right. I think, as somebody who's studied the history of civil rights movement and African-American history for almost a quarter of a century now, what you realize is that you're very aware of it all the time. And you're very aware that those issues are constantly with us. And of course, the media brings them into focus and focuses and concentrates on them for periods of time. And of course, the sort of the police shootings from Ferguson onwards have provided a line and a story for the media and have been at the very forefront of it. But I think race relations is always there as a major theme in American history. And sometimes it's more covered than others. Sometimes it's more in vogue with the press than others. Sometimes it gets to the media spotlight than others. But I think the important thing to understand is that it's always there. It's been there from the founding of the United States straight through to the present day. And sometimes I think we're more aware of it than others. But it is a constant kind of theme in American history and American life and American society. I think sometimes we're just conscious of it more than others.
Being in Arkansas, that's part of the South.
Ground zero.
Ground zero.
Right.
And working with a lot of the students there, because I grew up in Kansas, so I'm neighbors to Arkansas. But do you see a change in the 25 years of the students that you teach in their perception of racism?
Right. And, I've taught both in the United Kingdom and in the United States. I've taught in the United States consistently for the last 6.5 years. Mm-hmm. So I think what's interesting over time is that, as we were saying earlier, the civil rights movement, certainly from 1955 to 1965, that kind of classic period of the civil rights movement, seems further and further away. It does seem like ancient history.
Right.
I've been teaching this for 25 years now. So you do feel it going further and further away in the past. I taught my civil rights class just last semester to students. And what's fascinating and what really hit home to me teaching it this year is just how comfortable they are with 55 to 65 period and, desegregation and voting rights and all those kinds of things. They take all those kinds of things for granted. But really, when you hit 1965 and the Watts riots and housing discrimination and all those kinds of things, it feels really contemporary. It feels, all of a sudden as if you've moved from the past into something that we're still dealing with today. And the perspective and attitudes on that change markedly. So it's kind of fascinating how they view the early years of King as something that's safe and that's historical and that's now in the past. But when we get to the 65, 68, the later years of the 1960s, it is incredible how the same themes that are at the forefront of the civil rights movement then are still very much at the forefront of the civil rights movement today.
This is
so
fascinating.
It gives you the sense of just how the continuities, how much of a change that period was, but the continuities that have stayed in place for the last 50 years or so.
That was brilliant. That really makes sense. Like, it almost feels like there were two kings, because that first part does feel to me like 100 years ago, and the other part feels like, well, that was 20 years ago. And
Right.
That's exactly what you're saying. That's fascinating. That really summed up exactly how it does feel perceptually to me.
Right.
Certainly, I feel that way. I wonder why that is. Just those issues stay the same now? Why would that be?
I think it is. I think, it's fascinating that when we look at the last weeks of the class, just how contemporary it feels within the context of the present day. I think the civil rights movement did a particular job of ending what seems now archaic in terms of racial segregation, and certainly in the ways it was expressed in the Jim Crow South, with those signs on lunch counters and the widespread denial of voting rights and poll taxes and all those kinds of things. The civil rights movement really did away with those things to a large degree, although even some of those things are starting to resurface again now, and old battles are still starting to be refought. But certainly when you get on to things like the late 1960s, Watts, which begins with the shooting by a white police officer of an African-American person in the neighborhood. When you get to things like housing discrimination, when you get to a lot of those issues, you realize that, those were the issues that came to the forefront of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. And those things are still with us today, that we're still in that arc of that, 50-year of change that, I guess segregation was there for 60, 70 years. Slavery was there for many years before that. And you really feel that, by the late 1960s, we've entered into an arc that in many ways we're still part of and that we're still addressing. So King certainly feels very contemporary in his final years, and because he's addressing those very kinds of things that we're still trying to address today.
It's true. Those other things feel like it's another level to not be able to vote, to ride on a bus. I mean, that's another level.
Right. Well, my mother joined the Army in 1957. And I think they did basics in Alabama. I can't remember the town. But she says, she grew up born and raised in California. So she remembers going with her friends, and one happened to be an African-American. They get on the bus, and the bus driver gets up and tells my mother, no, you have to sit up front. And my mother's like,
see, that's insanity.
No, I'm sitting with my friends. And he said, then you can't ride the bus. So they got up and got off the bus. But it shocked the hell out of her because, she grew up in California with blacks and Mexicans and everybody that was going to the same high school. But do you think, this hypothetical, if Martin Luther King never existed, do you think somebody else would have just taken that role, or do you think it would have been a whole different ballgame?
I think somebody else would have emerged as a leader, or I think things would have changed over time, maybe not as quickly, and certainly not in the same way. I think King was important in terms of the things that he brought to the civil rights movement, his role as a preacher, his emphasis on nonviolent direct action, his ability to communicate and work between the African-American and white communities. So I think, change would have come. We don't know when and we don't know how, and it could have certainly come in a very different kind of way. But King's leadership of the civil rights movement and the tone that he set was certainly important in the civil rights movement playing out in the particular way that it did, I think.
Well, what about if he wasn't assassinated?
Or if, well, you think
the other extreme. What if
you
could
say that about Bobby Kennedy and
all these people?
Like what would the civil rights, I think it would have been excelled even further. I'm hoping.
Or sometimes these guys martyr, like you say. It could be. What do you think on that? What if he wasn't assassinated?
It's a fascinating question. In some ways, King's star was on the decline in 1968 when he was assassinated. There were many other leaders. The Black Power movement was emerging then. There were other people who were coming to the forefront of the civil rights movement. But this is a fascinating question of what King would have done had he lived. You know, would he have become, like Jesse Jackson, for example, a politician?
Right. That's exactly what I was going to literally say, that exact phrase. Would he be just today's Jesse Jackson of the day?
Right. Although, you know, King really sort of eschewed politics. He always saw himself as outside of politics. He always saw himself as a leader of the civil rights movement. So I'm not sure that he would, although many of his contemporaries did. You know, Andy Young became mayor of Atlanta. So a lot of his contemporaries did go into politics. I'm not sure that King would have done. Of course, we just don't know. It's very tantalizing. But, it's kind of interesting to think about where King would have stood today, because in some ways he was very liberal and, you know, would have pursued a liberal politics. But also as a preacher, in some ways, he was quite conservative as well. So, it's fascinating because King emerged in a very different time, as we've discussed, but also, you know, part of that is a very different kind of political context too. Different politics, different media altogether. And, you know, the terrain that King operated in the 50s and 60s now is completely different to the terrain you would operate in today. So it is fascinating to think about how King would have emerged. You know, there is a interesting episode of the series Boondocks, which is an African-American cartoon that actually deals with that. And, you know, there's an episode in which King is in a coma and comes out of a coma instead of being assassinated and is back today. And they riff on a lot of those things and play with all of those things. So it is a fascinating thing to think about, but a completely different time and a completely different context. And who knows how King would have operated then. And of course, you know, if a lot of the scandals that surround him that have subsequently came out contemporarily to him, he may never have had a career in the first place. And we may have lost a great leader in these times because, you know, certain things are picked up on by certain outlets and careers are lit and destroyed overnight. And King's longevity is part of his enduring influence. So a very different time, very interesting to think about how King might have operated in today's climate.
Have you, during your research, and it's hard to even believe that there's anything that we could find out more about him, but was there anything that really shocked you about who he was behind the scenes, just as a father, husband, that you didn't know at that point? Was there anything that really stood out to you?
Well, I think, you know, when we find out about the plagiarism, when we find out about the affairs of King, alleged affairs of King, you know, those kinds of things make you do a double take. But I think, you know, those things are important to learn as well. You know, I think one of the things about King is that we've often straitjacketed him in this Montgomery to Memphis narrative, and that, you know, Martin Luther King Day, we see King only in a 15-second soundbite saying, "I have a dream." And we sort of, you know, in some ways stripped him of his personality and stripped him of his humanity in some ways. We just kind of transferred him into a soundbite. And I think it's important to understand King in his many dimensions, which is why I really wrote this book, to try and bring to the fore some of the more hidden aspects that academics have looked at to public attention, of those different kinds of things, different ways of understanding King, and different perspectives on him to make him more human, to make him us come to terms with him as a human being. So I guess some of the things, you know, have surprised me. King's life has really been, and the sources relating to him have really been sort of mulled over very much now, and I'm not sure there's much more to come. Although, you know, one of the most interesting potentially sources are the wiretaps. You know, the FBI wiretapped King's phones and then illegally went on to tap his hotel rooms and have a much more invasive program of surveillance that went beyond its mandate, and has supposedly a lot of tapes that were taped in private of King after King's assassination. When these tapes came to light, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was the civil rights organization that he led, petitioned to have those tapes sealed because they were obtained illegally, and the courts agreed with them. So those tapes have an embargo on them and are held by the federal government now. and are not accessible. But in terms of what else we might be able to find out about King, someday those tapes may be released, and they may contain fascinating information, or they may not. So there are clutches of information that are beyond our reach at the moment that may or may not reveal more about King in the future.
Well, we only have just a few minutes left. Do you have anything? Because I want to ask one more question. So, it's 2017. We have a new administration. Do you see, because activism in politics has seemed to kind of become one, where activism back in the day, it had, its share of, run-ins with politicians, but do you see a new movement or a rise of someone of the Martin Luther King caliber coming again? Because it seems like you said, it seems like it's, racism is starting to grow again. Do you see that happening, or do you think politics is like infiltrated too much into the activism?
It's possible. Kind of thinking about contemporary developments today, I guess on one hand you could look to a Barack Obama as a Martin Luther King kind of figure who went into politics and took on a political angle. At the same time, if you look at activism and grassroots activism, you could point to the Black Lives Matter movement as being the legacy of the civil rights movement. But you're right that in some ways those have taken two very different kinds of tracks and don't seem to interact in the same kind of ways anymore. And King today, maybe, he would have gone into politics and would have been a Barack Obama of his time. Of course, that wasn't possible at his time because African Americans couldn't run for office. They couldn't vote. And that was a track that was denied to them. So King didn't really have those options. So maybe one of the changes that's taken place as a result of the civil rights movement is that the kind of grassroots wing and the respectable political wings have less compulsion to work with one another and to interact with one another. So we work in a very different environment. Of course, the Black Lives Matter movement, is very much a sort of social media-based movement. It's very much in tune with the technology of the time. It likes to say, sometimes I think that, this is not your mama's movement, some of the placards say, but I think there are a lot of interesting connections between the Black Lives Matter movement and civil rights, grassroots civil rights activism in the 50s and 60s that you can make the connections with. But again, of course, they'll operate in a very different kind of politics, society, and technological climate than those activists were. So I think there are important connections between activism and there's important continuity in activism. But I think each generation adapts its activism to the context of the time that it emerges in.
Well, this has been fascinating, and I hope people that listen make comments and tell us their thoughts on how they feel where racism is at in America. I'm just curious. I'm curious to how, because we get people from all over the world, all over the country that listen to our podcast, so I'd love to find out how you guys feel about that. But John, Kirk, thank you so much for being here. Martin Luther King, the Civil Rights Movement. You can get it on Amazon. Where else can we pick up the book?
All good bookstores.
Oh, good. Perfect. Yeah. Do you have any other projects you're going to be writing soon, or?
I'm working on another reader on the civil rights movement, a broader reader beyond King that will have commentaries on primary sources, and that should be out in a year or two.
Nice. Great. Well, you're going to have to come back.
Sounds good.
All right. Thank you, sir. We so appreciate you, and keep up the good work.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All right. You got it.
Thanks, Sean.
All right. Well, we're going to take no, we're not going to take a break. We're done.
No, Tony, this is it. That's the end of the show. There's no more breaks.
Oh, God. Well, we had two great shows.
Absolutely.
Captain Ron, thank you so much for being here and
course,
doing the things that you do. We appreciate all you guys for tuning in, making your comments on Facebook, Periscope Live.
Ethnicity.
That a boy. Did I say it? Ethnicity.
No.
Make sure you follow us on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, all those podcast outlets, and also on YouTube. We'd love to hear from you guys. We want to thank you, and we'll see you next week right here on Truth Be Told. Take care.